welcome back to another episode of
Just a Squirrel looking for a nut, trying to get out of this
rut.
Okay, that was 95% there, and I don't feel guilty. Oleg, I don't care what you say about the fact that I messed it up. I don't care.
I'm still laughing at how good the video is. Like that's a really, really, really good.
I might say I have to agree with that. And I don't feel guilty about saying that either. Sometimes you got to self-promote. What is the name of the guy that did that for us, by the way?
Richard Reimer.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. I can't help it but to laugh just out of pure joy every time I watch it.
Well, someone recently told me that one of those squirrels had a beard. I don't know if you know who that squirrel is supposed to represent or who that other blonde one with the one with that little tuft up there is supposed to be. But if you all guess, put it in the comments and we'll happily tell you whether you got it right. Mm-hmm. I'm going to start with a serious story tonight. We usually start with something a little bit on the silly side. Hello, Michelle Madden. How are you? It is good to have you back and good to see you. Thank you for joining us this evening. I was at a program actually one summer near your home in Austin, Texas, Oleg. I was at the LBJ school there. And there was a woman that I was friends with. And you know me, I like to joke around and tease people or just say ridiculous things. And I was being my usual jovial self and telling jokes. And she just glared at me. And I teased her and I said, "Oh, you're not laughing today? What's the matter with you? You don't know how to smile. Crack a smile." And I went on and on and on. And then someone said, "Well, her mother died." And I said, "Oh my God, I am so sorry. Well, no wonder you're not laughing." And I gave my condolences. And she just looked at me. And then we had been friendly the entire rest of the program, but after that, she never spoke to me again. And I later found out that she refused to forgive me for that, even though she knew full well that I didn't know that her mother had died. And I believe wanted me to feel guilty. Now, the silent treatment at that period in my life was a powerful weapon. Nowadays, don't try it on me. You'll just get silent treatment right back, or my back turn on you, or I'll just forget you exist. But back then, the silent treatment worked. And I felt so guilty the rest of my summer there. And it wasn't until I got back to my regular college and talked to some friends about this guilt that I was carrying around for how I had hurt this woman that a dear friend of mine basically snapped her finger in my face and said, "Get over it, Scott. You're being absurd. Why should you have felt guilty at all?" So I had been holding on to guilt that may or may not have been justified for a longer time than I, upon further reflection, thought was necessary. In fact, the total amount of time that I probably should have felt guilt was around 1 second. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't the way I operated. And I never got a formal opportunity to have a conversation with her about my guilt or my feelings about the behaviors that I believe were intended to trigger guilt. And sometimes, as you may guess, many years later, I still think about it. Was there a time frame or an expiration date that I should have had for my guilt? Michelle, Oleg, anyone else? Help me here.
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question, because I think if anything that I've learned around this whole concept of guilt, it's up to the person. So like in this case, it's completely up to you as far as what that time frame looks like. I've experienced similar things. I will also add on this, and I don't know if you experienced this or Michelle experienced this or anyone else, and that is when my sense of consciousness elevated and I became a lot more aware of my life and people in general, I have found that whole concept of guilt actually became even more, because I found, like, now, I don't know how to best describe this, but previously when, let's say, I would make a mistake, and that is I either forget to follow through or deliver on a promise, whatever I had made during a particular conversation. Now, when that happens, it's more so I almost like take that personally. So that guilt, it's almost like 2x or 5x from when it used to be way back in the day. And I think the awareness plays a really big role in it, because now I'm so much more aware and my conscious is aware of it. So doing the things that you just described, as far as choosing to apologize, or I don't remember who said this. I think it might have been one of the people that we've had on this show as one of the guests, but I think he or she might have said that they choose to apologize first. You know, it's almost like a responsibility that one carries in saying that, hey, I'm sorry for this has happened, in order to prevent some of these other things for the future. And I think the same exact thing applied for me throughout many situations where I would make mistakes, because, I mean, I'll face it, I'm human. And yes, even though I'm in this role and creating all this content and all this work, like, I still make mistakes. I make hundreds of mistakes, but yet I'm still finding myself sometimes I find myself to be guilty of, like, not fully, you know, following through or delivering or meeting someone else's expectation of what it needs to be. Because that's the other part of the story that I get curious, is like, to what degree are we meeting someone else's expectation, especially in situations where that expectation is not verbalized?
What types of mistakes lead you to feel guilty? And what sorts of mistakes lead you to not feel guilty at all? And Michelle actually had a remark that I would ask for her to consider while you answer that question, and that is, you put that up there, but the last sentence of that remark, thank you for that remark, says apologize to give yourself some grace. Michelle, I would love to get your thoughts as Oleg answers my question about what sort of mistakes he feels guilty about or not. I'd love for you to answer, what do you mean by grace?
You know, I think for me, it's a really good question, because there definitely is I guess you could say, like, a distinguishing factor between some of the things that I feel guilty with and others not so much. I have found myself that with my level of awareness continuing to increase, that concept of guilt comes a lot more often. I'll give you a perfect example. The other day when I was walking Caleb, who's my dog, should probably be another star of this show.
Yeah.
You know?
We'll have him be a special guest one time.
But I was walking him and I realized that I didn't have any poop bags. And so I kept walking, and there was a poop bag station that was probably, I don't know, a quarter of a block away or something, that I was walking towards. And he just had to go to the bathroom, like, literally there and then. And so I let him go, and then my intention was to go and get the bag, come back and pick it up. Now, on my way to getting the bag, I had noticed that there was a person that got out of the car, one of my neighbors, and she actually stood there the whole time, observing which action I was going to take next.
Oh,
whether
wow.
I was going to walk away and leave it there, or if I was going to go get the bag and come back and pick it up. Now, my conscious chose to go get the bag, come back and pick it up, and then, you know, from there, continue along. She thanked me for it. She thanked me for coming back and picking it up, because she said not many people do that. Now, I will say that's a situation where guilt almost led me into that action. I still probably would have done it anyway. But
were you a little bit annoyed about doing it for that exact reason, perhaps?
No, I think right now I carry, I think, greater responsibility as a citizen. And I think part of that reason is because I have stepped in dog poop so many times that, like, I did get annoyed when it happens.
Yeah. And you didn't want to be contributing.
I didn't want to be contribute to someone else's problem that I experience.
So before we move on, Stephen Ramirez is in the house. Stephen is very near and dear to me. Stephen, it is good to see you. He is an incredible human being. And I think that his comment is interesting. So Stephen has a very long history working in positions of significant responsibility in both the nonprofit and in the government sectors. And in the current job that he has right now, one of the things that he needs to do is ensure quality of service for a government agency that is doing important work for constituents that live in the city of New York. I won't say any more about Stephen's job because I don't know to what extent that he would want that out there, but his job is amazing. And if you want to know more about it, I'm sure it's on his LinkedIn profile. What he's talking about underneath that response is linked a little bit to what you're saying, which is that there is a guilt that we might have because of an injury that we caused to others. But what Stephen may or may not be talking about, but at least conceivably could be talking about, and that you definitely were, is guilt because of potential impacts and the way that they could affect the lives of people who we know nothing about. In Stephen's case, it's the general public in the city of New York. In your case, it's anyone randomly walking down the streets of Austin, Texas. But there's another theme here as well, because you're also, at least conceivably, talking about behaviors that could impact your own self-expectations as to who you are. And the same also, at least conceivably, could be said about Stephen's remark. Let's face it, in a lot of large organizations, there are many, many, many people who don't seem particularly guilty if their behaviors or if their work doesn't meet minimal quality standards. I won't say any more, except to say that Stephen is not one of those people. That's why I love him.
But it's very true. I think it directly, as you said, it ties into this whole standard. And I guess the question that I'm choosing to, not always, but remind myself of is, what is my standard? And how does that change in regard to the circumstances? I think for me, the action that I choose to take, even in situations where I don't have a poop bag, still to come back and pick it up because I'm consciously thinking about the other person and what they might experience. And the other thing that I know I think about, and I don't necessarily take this on as my own weight to carry, but people are fighting their own battles. And something like that, like stepping in dog food, could literally be the last straw for someone. And the last straw before what? I mean, who knows? Who knows what that thing may lead to? But I think it's just more so choosing to accept that as, once again, a greater form of responsibility. Does everyone do that? No. Do I see people that leave it where it is? Yes. Are there times where I will actually say something? Absolutely. There have been times where I called people out on the street that chose not to pick it up. And I remember one time.
What did you say to him? Tell us about that.
One time, this was, I think, 2 weeks ago, I was walking Caleb, and there was another person walking I think it was a golden retriever. And, the dog pooped on, not on the sidewalk, but in the front yard of the complex that I live in. And she didn't pick it up. And I looked at her. I was probably half a block away, when it all happened. And she left it there. She looked around, to make sure no one was watching. And she was about to make her way. And then I picked up some speed. And as I got closer to her, I had asked her the question. I said, "Ma'am, will you be picking that up?" True story. And she had said something, how she didn't have a bag. And she ended up, walking towards a station that had a bag. I mean, I continued along. I guess another action I could have taken from there is I could have waited there for her to come back. So I don't know if she actually come back and did it, but I know that she made a conscious effort towards wanting to go get a bag.
Do you feel guilty about having called her out? Do you ever feel like you're kind of a male version of, the Karen stereotype when you do that sort of thing?
I did. I mean, I felt guilty in calling her out because, I mean, I feel like that takes courage. I think for me, it took courage to call someone out on something like that. I also think that there are so many different situations throughout life, and I'm curious to hear if you've experienced the same exact thing. But this whole concept of mind your own business,
Yes.
it's such a
One we've talked
dominant
about a lot
phrase,
here, actually. Yes.
and it's such a dominant thought where situations like this can sometimes fall under that umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's say littering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you litter, oftentimes I've received the comment of just mind your own business, keep going.
Mm-hmm.
But like I don't think that phrase is applicable in every situation. Like I think in my opinion, there are situations where I choose to interject to change the person's behavior because it impacts someone else so greatly.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the mind your own business is something that I would toss back in someone's face under two circumstances. One, where I'm really engaging in a behavior that affects no one but me.
Mm-hmm.
Or whomever I am with or whatever I'm with. For instance, if I am holding my husband's hand in Central Park and someone feels the need to voice an opinion about that, that's sort of a situation where they get to mind your own business. Because really, that only bothers them or affects them to the extent that they may be seeing something they don't like. Well, tough.
Exactly.
Because New York City, there's going to be a lot of things you don't like. And if you cannot handle seeing things you don't like, get your ass out of the city. But on the other hand, sometimes I will say it as a defense mechanism because I know I'm wrong and I don't want to admit it. And I don't want to put myself in a position where I feel guilty, because if I don't admit that I'm wrong about something, I don't need to feel guilty, and I don't need to then later forgive myself, which is what Michelle Madden was talking about. Michelle, thank you for answering the question about what you mean by grace. I don't need to grant myself that grace as is explained by Michelle. And all of that whole process of feeling the guilt and then accepting responsibility for your action and forgiving is a lot easier than just blaming somebody else. Or I'm sorry, it's a lot harder than just blaming somebody else and telling them to mind their own business. But people, there was a woman I was at a retirement party with one time, and a man left that party plastered to drive home. And everyone was sort of looking at each other like, this is kind of not cool. But we all chose to mind your own business. And anyone watching this who is from New York City or who has lived here before understands that in New York City, more so than most places, there's a very strong ethos of minding your own business, because you don't know who that other person is and they might kill you. Mm-hmm. But in this case, this one person in the party said, no, I'm not going to mind my own business, because he could hit someone when he's driving home. It's not just him endangering himself. There's a child that could lose their parent. There is a parent that could lose a child. There are people that could be exactly. And so she went out and found him and called him out, and guiltlessly. And if she felt any guilt about it, I can guarantee you that guilt was over in a snap.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I can relate to much of what you said. Before I get into it further, I just wanted to say hello to Brian, who's a mutual.
He's terrific. Wonderful guy.
But it's what you just described as far as the circumstance of feeling the guilt as far as it relates to the concept of someone driving or driving under the influence of something. I've experienced those things, I think, from a younger age. I mean, there are many times where I chose not to say something, or when I did, I was called all kinds of different names, and like, oh, okay, here's someone who's always on the quote unquote panic alert and anxious. But the reality is I was just genuinely concerned. I was concerned about my own safety as well as the safety to other people. So I think to a degree, whether I feel guilty or not, there are some times where I realize that it's my responsibility. But it's only my responsibility because I chose it to be my responsibility. There's no like written contract I had to sign that's saying, hey, once I hit this age, I have to call out people on X, Y, and Z, even if I feel guilty doing it. It's just a choice. It's just a choice that I'm making every step of the way, just like anything else.
I want to welcome Lucretia Lamora back into the house. Lucretia, I know you've been busy for a while, so you haven't been able to join us, but you were one of our original fans, and it is good to see you again. You're the owner of the Sensuous Bean, New York City's top coffee store, and your honesty here is, as always, very much appreciated.
Do you?
Go ahead, Oleg.
Quick
please.
question for you, Scott. Do you ever feel guilty for being misunderstood?
Yes.
Especially when it comes to someone asking you, like, what do you do for a living?
It depends on the consequences of what I will generally describe as my own miscommunication. I'll usually assume that I'm the one that's miscommunicating. And some people might find that a little bit odd because I am a professional communicator. So I should be able to clearly articulate myself. But if anything, that puts a higher onus on me to communicate in a way that makes sense. And nothing has been more frustrated in my professional life. And Stephen Ramirez, if you're still here, you don't have to say anything about what I'm going to have to say. You can just think whatever you want to inside. But nothing made me more frustrated than, for instance, when I had a boss who would tell me left and right what she didn't like that I did, but never tell me what she liked. So I was always running around feeling guilty for failing without ever having any guidance about what I should be doing to succeed. And eventually that lack of guidance about that lack of positive affirmation and the constant statements about my guiltiness for doing this, that, or the other, caused me to have that person lose credibility, and I lost all guilt. But that being said, I still feel, as a general matter, and as someone who believes in radical self-accountability, if I miscommunicate, usually that is my problem. If I've hurt someone, or if I've reacted in frustration to that person only to find out that they were acting reasonable because of my miscommunication, then yes, I feel guilty about it. But that's the sort of thing where I will take accountability publicly, or at least to that person's face, and communicate appropriately and ask them if they understand. Now, staff or people that work for me, I do say, ask me if you don't understand. And usually when I give instructions to people, I'll ask if they have any questions, which I would prefer that they say, I don't understand a word you just said, and then I can explain. But sometimes people don't really realize that they don't understand something until after they think about it later, or they look at their notes, in which case, again, my lack of communication is something that I feel guilty about because I've inconvenienced them. But lack of appropriate communication is also part of the human experience. It's part of the fact that we're isolated in our own providential rivers. We're islands in the stream, as the cliche goes. And so that's always going to happen. Sometimes I've miscommunicated to my husband and I've hurt him because of that. I feel guilty. But one thing that he always says to me is, even hurting each other, if it's not intentional, that's part of the human experience. We get over it. We're resilient.
Did you just come up with that? Islands in the stream?
Of course not. I'm not that creative.
That's a really classic
poetic song. Yeah, well, I won't say who.
I wouldn't even feel guilty if you didn't.
If anyone knows who sang that song, put it in the comments, and we will absolve you of any guilt for your sins of the day accordingly. And Bernard, it is so good to see you. Welcome, and thank you for commenting.
Are you connected with Bernard?
I believe I am. Now, let me ask you this, Oleg. Would you feel guilty for an action that you did that hurt someone else if you knew you were never going to get caught?
Like murder?
That's an extreme case, but let's use that as an example.
Yes. I would feel, in knowing who I am now, yes. Because I think it's just one of those things that, if I feel guilty not picking up dog poop, murder, as you mentioned, it's an extreme example, but I think it's actually one of the questions that I've had on the back of my mind as far as those that choose to do such act, how do they process that? And how do they live with that particular experience? Because in my opinion and my own experience, like that would occupy so much of my mind and so much of my conscious thought that I don't know. To be honest, I don't know if I'll be able to move past that thought.
Bernard said something that goes directly to that point, which is that only narcissistic leaders keep you in the dark. I believe Bernard was referencing my remark earlier about that boss that I had.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say any more except to acknowledge the remark and the fact that I don't disagree with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it goes as to what I was asking, because I also would be curious, would there ever be an action that you could commit or would commit that would be such a trigger for guilt that you would feel the need to end your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that I just described, taking someone else's life, I was having a conversation like this recently where a friend of mine had mentioned how it was difficult for him to process individuals that choose to take someone else's life, and he was more so speaking in terms of, you know, do individuals like that deserve a second chance or second opportunity? But for me personally speaking, if I were to do such act, I think that would be one of those. You know, taking a life, it's an extreme form, but I know that is one that I either would have a difficult time living with, or I don't know if I would be able to live with it.
Would it matter if it were an accident or not?
That's a really good question, because there have been times throughout my life where such accidents almost did take place.
Yeah.
I remember one time, in fact, I was driving through Austin, and it was relatively late at night, probably 10 or 11 o'clock, and I was somewhat in a rush. I was trying to get home. I think it might have been in one of those situations where the storm, like we were experiencing pretty severe rain, and for anyone that is in Texas, you know, when it rains, like it pours. I mean, it's like tropical rain. So it was very difficult to see. And I was trying to get back home. I don't remember. I think it might have been to actually take out Caleb. I had, you know, there were so many hours that had gone by and he hadn't gone to the bathroom just yet. And so I was rushing back home, and I was making a right turn onto First Street, I think it was. And there was a person that chose to, instead of waiting, which I wouldn't blame them by any means, they chose to cross the street. I think they were in the rush as well to get out of the storm. And I don't know how close I was, couple feet, but couple feet from a story like that or a situation like that. And I'll tell you this, that even though it did not take place, that thought alone still occupied the back of my mind for the entire way back. I mean, I was constantly running through the scenarios of what would I have done? Who would I have called? I mean, if that's a situation that happens, let's say in a worst case scenario, that person dies.
Yeah.
And theoretically, like, what if I was at fault?
Yeah.
Even though I think in their case, they would have been at fault, I guess, because I had the green light to turn and they were crossing, you know, the sidewalk. But anyway, it's not necessarily the point of the law, but more so it's just the point of the consciousness. Because, like, yes, I might face the penalty when it comes to the law itself, or they might, but if I take their life, that's something I got to live with for the rest of my life.
Do you think, even with a lot of work, that you could grant yourself the grace that Michelle Madden talked about earlier?
You know, yes and no. I think that's one of the situations where it's difficult to understand, like, how would it play out, and would I be able to do the work to reframe it into another circumstance? My internal belief says that yes, it would be possible, but what would the process look like? I have no idea. I have no idea because I've never experienced anything like that. I've never experienced a situation where, even in a case like that, taking someone else's life by accident. I mean, that's a very different set of circumstances than being brought up in what I was brought up in, or any of the other challenges that I've faced along the way. So it would have been a different story had it happen, and if it were to take place like that. And maybe the lesson that I learned there is to move to New York City and, operate a bicycle like you do.
Although, I still get scared about that because, sometimes I'll be riding in the bicycle lane and people decide that the bicycle lane is the perfect place to just walk with their little infant children dawdling along.
And some people go fast. I have a friend of mine that lives in Brooklyn. I have a couple of friends that live in New York, and when they bike, man, they easily go 20, 25 miles per hour.
Yeah, I myself am flying down that road sometimes, especially if I'm looking down and if you're going downhill and there's no traffic, the assumption is that, I'm in the bicycle lane, so it's safe. And then all of a sudden, and this has happened to me, all of a sudden a dad pulls out of his car and decides to just sort of have the kid stand in the middle of the bicycle lane and look around. Right. And I hit the brake on the bicycle and I spun it around and no one was hurt, thank God. And he yelled at me for almost hurting his child, where I said, and in the moment even I was like, well, why in the hell were you putting a child in the middle of the bicycle lane? And just standing there. But if I had hit that child, that's one of those things too, where I suspect I would have been guilty for the rest of my life. I felt guilty for the rest of my life. And that's the sort of thing, particularly a child taking away something so young and precious to me, that just really goes as to the core of some of the worst things that you could do to someone. What about then, let's move in a little bit further. What about a crime of passion versus something that you premeditated out of need? And I'll give an example of the latter. So it's not as removed as it might seem in the movies or on crime shows on television or on Netflix, which is that, let's say, Oleg, you were told that you could get a speaking gig before the United Nations, and it would have the biggest audience possibly in the history of the United Nations. And you would make enough money from that you could live off the entire year, but you also knew that you would get enough opportunity so that you would never have to solicit another gig again.
Can you connect me with that person?
Well, yes. I'll do that tomorrow.
That would simplify a lot of
maybe
things.
Bernard or Lucretia or Brian or Stephen or Michelle know that person. God knows I don't. But in any event, let's say this were to happen, and let's say it was a situation where you were desperate for money. You weren't sure if you could feed yourself or Caleb. And it had been a long time, and you said to yourself, I'll do anything. And someone says, all you need to do is to just change the date of your submission, and fudge that. And then the person who was going to get the gig will just not get the gig, and you'll be the person to get it. So you do that little thing, which is premeditated, and it's an apparently small ethical blunder. Then you find out that this person that you bumped was going to give a talk about genocide. And that talk was going to be given so that they could be protected from disappearing as part of a genocide. And because of you doing that little action, that person was disappeared forever. That's premeditated. Would you be able to would you feel guilty about that? And if so, would you be able to get over it? As opposed to, and I know I'm going complex here, but I know also that this audience and you can, walk and chew gum at the same time. Non-premeditated is you're walking down the street and someone out of the blue comes out with a knife and starts ramming it, running towards Caleb, and just out of the blue for no reason jabbing it. And you have to defend Caleb against this attacker. That's crazy. And in that fight, the person dies. Would you feel guilty under either of those circumstances? And if so, how long would you feel guilty, and what would that guilt look like?
I think the first one, I probably would only feel guilty if I was talking to you afterwards and you just described the situation to me the way that you did. And that is, you covered all of the angles. Now, I think the guilt in that particular case, I think it comes from awareness. So if I was not aware of who that person was and what their topic was, and also how great of an impact or influence such a conversation can have, then I probably wouldn't experience much guilt. And I think that it's also a relevant point in regard to today's day and age of cancel culture. People get canceled. I got canceled many times throughout my life, left and right. I don't know what the reasons are. I think might as well go down this rabbit hole now. But one of the situations I think where I've been canceled was due to the fact that I didn't follow a particular religion. So it didn't align with the group's standards for what a speaker had to have as far as their background. Now, is that something that I personally feel guilty because, oh man, I wish I was X, Y, and Z, then I would have had the engagement? No. Do they feel guilty for making that decision? I don't know. So, but back to your point, I think the first case, I would only feel guilty if my level of awareness was as high as you just described. If I was able to see every single angle of that and also understand the larger influence and the impact of that situation, then yeah, of course I would have felt guilty. The second case, if it's someone charging at Caleb, and I'm trying to recall the story here.
To defend Caleb, you get into a fight.
Yeah. I think that guilt is different because I'm defending someone else's life. So I think when it's a life or death situation, I think the concept of guilt takes a different shape compared to making a decision where I'm bumping someone up the schedule, or I'm choosing one speaker over the other, or I'm not choosing to let someone else be part of a group compared to letting people be part of a group to preserve the energy and the space of a particular thing that we chose to create as a community or as a collective. But I think in the case of Caleb, I think a form of guilt would probably exist, but the fact that Caleb was attacked first and his life was at risk, I think in a way it would maybe justify my action. Now, it would still be something that I would have to live with. I'm sure it's a thought that would be in the back of my mind that I literally took someone else's life. Now, would it be to a point where I may take my own life afterwards? I don't know. Quite possibly. But that's only because I value humanity so much. I value another person's life with, great intensity, where I'm always conscious about other people. And I think there's a difference here to note, like people pleasing and then being aware of other people and how it's impacting them. So not necessarily like living up to their standards, but more so living according to my standards and understanding that my actions do impact the lives of others.
I would love anyone that is listening or watching right now or down the road to comment on this if you have an opinion. And Oleg, I very much would value your thoughts on the scenario I'm about to tell you. I think about this sort of stuff all the time. Maybe it's because I'm insane. I don't feel guilty about that, by the way, because I'm not hurting anyone with my insanity, except my husband who has to listen to me all the time. But that's a different story. So,
us right now, but yeah.
and us, I'm torturing via LinkedIn and Facebook Live, yes. But that's voluntary suffering every single one of you are putting yourself through. So I'm not going to feel guilty for your own masochism. So you are the president of the United States, and you get a phone call. And it's the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff or whoever is in charge of national security for this particular thing. And they say there is a nuclear missile from North Korea headed towards San Francisco at this moment. You need to act. And you wake up, you hear this, you understand you cannot let this go unanswered, and there cannot be delay. So you send retaliatory nuclear bombs to wipe North Korea off the face of this earth. And because you're the United States, you succeed. North Korea, the next morning, within 4 hours, is in the Stone Age.
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco is never hit because it was a mistake. Do you feel guilt?
Well, damn. There goes my presidency, or at least shot for it. I'm going to be judged by the answer to this question here. What do you do when there is a nuclear strike? So it's a difficult question to answer, and here's why. Because I think it really boils down to what do you choose to value? And I don't know enough about the presidency as far as what they take into consideration when it comes to such decisions. I mean, does the decision largely revolve around kind of protecting as many people as possible, compared to a small sacrifice, or is it vice versa? Or does every life equal the same thing? So because it's one life lost, it's equivalent to 1,000 lives lost. So I think it pretty much depends on the system of that. But personally speaking, once again, there goes the presidency. I don't know what I would do. I would probably look my first thought would be to try and somehow resolve it through kind of peaceful conversation.
The act is done. It's 4 hours later.
Oh.
Nice try, though, Oleg.
I probably would feel guilt. I would feel guilt because that's still lives on my own, based on my decision. That were gone regardless of which country lost it. In fact, I think that's one of the hardest things. I would love to ask that question. I know I ask this question to people who are in the military quite often, as far as how do you view a life, especially people in combat. How do you process that? How do you process the fact that you are about to take a life, and according to the ones that I've spoken with, sometimes if you don't take that life can take thousands of other lives. So how do you process that in the moment while also understanding that there's a finite amount of time on it? You can't sit there forever and think about okay, here, I'm going to weigh out all these options. You literally sometimes, okay, I'm basing all of this off of, American Sniper and the way that the scenes are described in that movie. But you literally have a person walking from point A to point B, and that is your time frame to make a decision that is going to impact the trajectory moving forward. Now I want to put that question back to you, Scott, just, because I might have lost the presidency, so I don't want to be the only one here. I'm feeling guilty. What would you do in your scenario?
After Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, the leadership of the American government pretty much, as I understand it, universally said they didn't lose a single second of sleep from guilt over the bombings of those cities. And I'll tell you, I will accept as a leader that I am going to make mistakes, and that the consequences of my mistakes are going to be greater than most. If I genuinely felt that the United States was under threat, had no contrary information, and it was, it was 4 hours later, no, I would not feel guilty.
Because
I would feel more guilty.
An action or decision that had to be made?
Totally. And I would feel a lot more guilty if I hemmed and hawed and hesitated and San Francisco was wiped off the map. However, because we are the squirrels, we're going to open up this acorn, because I see in that a profound question that we don't always wrestle with when we think about these things, which is the relationship of guilt for actions that impact large groups of other people, like genocides that occur, and the idea of tribalism. Because what I'm saying by not having guilt is that my people matter more than theirs. It would be one thing if I just had a targeted strike and somehow were able to kill the leadership that sent that nuclear bomb. But knowing full well that nuclear bomb or that weapon does not exist, I choose to wipe an entire country off the face of the earth. Again, being honest, Oleg, and destroying my own future, probably, I wouldn't feel guilty. But is that saying something about me? And I'm trying to get away from this word, by the way. So have patience with me. I feel guilty every time that little crutch thing comes out of my mouth.
I love it.
Oleg, there is a movement, and it is lauded within the United States, of buying American, buying local, supporting local businesses, supporting our own economy before we take the reach of our dollars elsewhere and spend our money on cheap goods that are made under oppressive conditions in countries like Bangladesh, China, Thailand, or India. But the argument that is contrary to that is that who are we to place the lives of some people of higher value and the economic security of higher value than those of others, particularly when those people have access to resources and opportunities that those in the other countries will never have. Who are we to stamp our foot down on the rising tide of global prosperity? And should we not feel guilt for that? If we all, particularly those that ascribe to certain faith traditions, truly believe that in the eyes of God, we are the same, that God cries for the death of a Bangladeshi child as much as he does for an American child, who are we to say, don't go where it's cheapest. Don't support these local economies. Support someone living in a rich country that has social welfare to survive, not having that cup of coffee bought from them or whatever, that T-shirt. And I say this, by the way, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but to say that there is some narrowness in the thinking, at least arguably, that we have around this stuff. Why do we matter more than them?
And that goes to a point that I was going to bring up, is this whole thing about claiming ownership over a particular group, especially when it comes to countries. And I'll give you an example. I think oftentimes when I hear this whole concept of my people versus your people, I don't really subscribe to that. I don't subscribe to that because for me, United States is not my people, nor is Russia, nor is any other country. Like, I look at the person for who they are. There's nothing about the person that is mine, so to speak. And so I think that's where, even with your example of looking at the different products from different countries, it's not that I don't choose to look at those things, because I do acknowledge when a product says, made in China or made in Bangladesh or made in the United States. But I don't take it to the degree where I support one over the other. I think for me, I choose to support the quality, and I choose to support whatever the purpose that the thing serves. If it's convenience, if it's quality, if it's, durability, whatever it is. That's the thing I support. I support the actual thing itself rather than any specific thing. But that also goes to the whole concept of guilt, because I have faced that many times through some of the conversations that I've had with people that would say, well, why are you not supporting something that's made, solely in the United States? Or why are you only buying products that are made in this country? Or even the whole thing, let's even step outside of that. Like, the fact that one chooses to be vegan and the other one chooses to be vegetarian, and then someone else continues to eat meat. Like, why do I have to feel guilty according to someone else's lifestyle, according to someone else's perspective of what they see, that I may not be able to see the same exact way? Like, you might not choose to eat meat because you actually can't, due to some condition or whatever it is that you experience in life. Now, for me, it might be good to eat certain type of meat because that's the thing, that's how my body operates. So I just it's an interesting point that you bring that up, and I'm curious to actually hear from you if you experience a similar form of guilt when it comes to your eating habits.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I actually do feel some guilt about that sometimes.
Yeah.
However, it is a guilt that's modulated. First of all, I am not someone, and this is a statement that many will disagree with, and we will have to have a respectful disagreement around that. And I don't pretend to know everything either. I do not believe that humans are the same as other species. I don't believe that other species should have human rights. Maybe they have some gradation of human rights depending on their level of sentience or brain development or whatever. And I certainly don't advocate for cruelty to animals. In fact, I'm vehemently opposed to that. But I don't at the same time view there as no species differentiation between us and cockroaches. So and heaven help me if I start to go down that road. However, as many people who know me know, and this is no secret, I have a history, as my doctors have repeatedly told me, of type 2 diabetes. I have been told by my doctors repeatedly that I have a history of it because for close to 2 decades, my blood glucose, without any medicine whatsoever, has been actually lower than many non-diabetics, and it maintains that rate for some time. It has maintained that rate for many years, and it actually has a hard time varying at this point. Why? Because of dietary choices that I have made that have required me to eat certain types of animal flesh in order to get the appropriate balance of protein and carbohydrates in my system so that I can maintain a healthy blood glucose level. Now, some vegan advocates have said to me, well, Scott, there are proteins that you can get from plants. I'm aware of that. However, the proteins that I can get from plants, either directly contradict or run against the diet that enables my blood glucose to stay under control, or B, my body has a violent reaction to. And so from my perspective, my body is telling me I have to have some animal flesh and keep my carbohydrate intake of a certain type and at a certain level, and my fat intake to some extent as well. And then I am optimizing my physical functionality. And who am I to argue against that? The other thing, too, I say about that is that we're all, although I do not believe that we are the same as other animals, I view the difference between us and other animals as one that is of degree, not of absolute order. Dogs and cats are different types of animals, but they are both animals and they're both mammals, and they're both predatory mammals. Humans are animals. We are a species of animals, but we are animals. And we are animals that have a predatory history. And in fact, as you and I have spoken about before off the screen, we rose to the top of the food chain by killing any species that got in our way, whether for food or purely to eliminate a threat.
This is humans, not us,
Humans.
to clarify.
Yeah.
Not the
And
pure
so
ones.
is that itself something that we as a species should feel guilty about? I think that that's a controversial statement to make, and one that is a lot less definitive in its answer than might seem on the surface. Because if we are animals, why should we feel any more guilty for behaving in accordance with our animal nature than any other animal, particularly when it comes to things like that don't involve the skills that are at the top of our brain, things like food and diet, or sexuality even.
And I think that also brings another point, as you were sharing all of this, is should is a strong word, but let's use it in this case. Should one feel guilty because of their difference or their uniqueness? For example, you might have the skills to do X, Y, and Z, but I may not have the same skills. I may have other skills. And in that case, should I feel guilty because I'm able to do something that you're not? And therefore, I'm able to possibly create opportunities that you might not be able to experience because you do not have the same skill set. I mean, I think that same thing is applicable to what you just described in regard to the animals part. You know, like
should we feel guilty that we have the intellect and the ability to kill them and eat them?
Exactly. And even in the same exact thing, like, should I feel guilty due to the fact that I can go to the bathroom all on my own, but Caleb can't? You know, in the environment and the circumstances he is in, he needs my help to be able to get outside or give him food or whatever it is that comes along the way. Now, I'm sure if push comes to shove, kind of like if he were to go outside, you know, on his own, he might be able to survive and find those things, find those resources. But that is, for me, I think is a great question as far as should one feel guilty due to the difference or the uniqueness.
Should we feel guilty for having pets?
That's a really good question, because I mean, it is a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to share a space with a pet. You know, it's a privilege compared to other people who are not, but also the whole guilt component of it, that goes back to the hierarchy, right? Having a sense of ownership. I mean, that goes back to the same thing that I think I pointed out earlier, the whole concept of when you look at a country specifically. Now, not everyone does this, but sometimes I'll hear like, oh, this is my people. You know, going back to your example, like I have to defend my people, when the reality of the matter is, what about me is his or hers?
You know, I love that show, The Walking Dead.
Mm-hmm.
I like it, even though it's been in decline for a number of years now, but it's still on. So someone besides me must like it. And that's actually a theme there. My people versus your people. But they're all Americans. Every single individual in this is an American. Yeah. But they divide themselves up into these little tribes, and there's always this battle for dominance and for limited resources, and people are subject to merciless slaughter by the outgroup unless the outgroup ultimately integrates them into it. Inevitably, that's the theme of that show. Some of the outgroup always gets integrated into the in-group, and then their identities shift and all that sort of stuff. You know, you talked earlier about, let's say, and we both did, about killing someone and feeling guilty for the rest of our lives about that. And I will say, you know, under the rights, there I went, you know, again. If
anyone can help us with the you know meter here, please.
There are some phrases that we're trying to get away from here, right? We that I just used is one of those that we have this mutual agreement about. I'm going to use it again, to move away from. Because, you know, people don't always know. I'm saying, you know, and while we're always talking about these philosophical things, who am I to say you know anything?
Yeah.
You don't know a doggone thing, and I don't know anything. So anyway, Oleg, would you feel guilty if the person you killed was someone that you killed when you were a child? Like, let's say you were 6 or 7 years old and you accidentally did something or intentionally played a prank and someone died. Would you feel guilty for the rest of your life?
I would feel guilty. I don't think it would be the same level of guilt. I think the level of guilt would be different compared to when I'm older, because I'm able to think through my actions more. Now, once again, that's an assumption. That's assuming that I would be able to think through my actions as I get older. But in knowing who I am now, using a real life example, I think the level of guilt would still exist, but I don't think it would be as great, because I think I would be able to justify it through the fact that I was a young kid who truly didn't know any better. Now, if the situation was different, like I said, if it happened yesterday, I would feel a tremendous amount of guilt. I would feel a tremendous amount of guilt because I do know better. I do have an understanding of what a human life is worth, at least to me, and the value of it. And also seeing actions from other people taking someone else's life helps me better understand why I choose not to partake in such actions. Now, when I'm younger and I'm not able to see that, I think it's a different story.
Oleg, answer me to the best of your ability. And if you don't feel comfortable answering this question, then be honest.
Yeah, I'll just leave
I and everyone else will forgive you for not answering, because there may be a reason why you choose not to answer this.
Yeah.
Do you believe, as I do, and I am saying this out here, but I utterly and completely respect your right to disagree or not reveal this at all. Do you believe in the concept of providence?
Can you expand upon that just briefly? How do you define that?
Roughly, as a force that is above and beyond humanity, but that ultimately shapes the past, present, and future of the universe.
I believe in an aspect of it. I'll tell you what I believe in. I believe in a form of energy. I do believe that there's some force that is able to do many of the things that it does. I don't choose to believe in any specific figure that resembles that force.
This force that you believe in, if it ultimately is governing this universe, then presumably its powers include the monitoring and the shaping of our universe, which includes the actions that we take that hurt others. And if that is true, should any of us ever feel guilt for anything?
I think the answer to that question is yes. Well, I'll speak
it's
for
all
myself.
part of the plan.
I'll speak for myself. I think it's part of the plan. I don't think it's the plan. I think what creates the plan is a combination of the two. What I mean by that, it's that higher force, the energy, the universe, whatever I choose to subscribe to. But I also believe that I play a significant role within that as well. I think the things that, as we described, that are above us, that are able to, or above us or within us, whatever it is, right? That are able to help me navigate through it. I think if anything, those are guiding points, but I still have to choose the action. I still have to be a participant within this larger scope or this larger game, whichever way you want to look at it. That's what I believe in. I don't believe that there's, predestined plan, because if there is that thing, then what's the point of us? Are we even relevant in that?
From a providential perspective, do you believe that to commit the moral lapse that you might feel guilty for is the failure? Or do you think that the failure to feel guilt over that lapse is the failure?
That is a really, really good question. Assuming that it's a sequence, so assuming that guilt is the thing that follows whatever that action is, then, I guess one could argue that failure to feel the guilt or can't, that's the thing that's perceived as failure. But I'll also add on to that, though. Failure is an interesting topic because I don't know if I believe in that. I don't know if I believe in the concept as a whole. I think the opportunity to fail is the opportunity to make a mistake that one has the ability to learn from. But in your case, I think maybe to a degree, failure to recognize. But what if you're not able to? I mean, going back to the whole thing, you might have a sense of empathy and I don't. You might have a sense of confidence and I don't. Just the way that I'm born and the way that I'm made up. So in the same exact thing, what if I'm physically not able to recognize what guilt feels like? And therefore, my way of proceeding does not include guilt in that sequence of things that happen post the action.
Have you ever wondered what it would be like to never feel guilt?
Not actively. I think the thought come in once or twice, but the reason why I don't choose to engage in it as often as I guess I would like to is because I just think that guilt is something that's always there. Just like many of the other thoughts, like depression, anxiety, stress. In my opinion, I don't believe it's possible to eliminate that feeling ever. I think if anything, it transforms. I think it takes a different shape. I think it kind of like that onion analogy. You peel one layer of it just to get to the next.
Do you think that society could exist if none of us felt guilt?
That would be hard because then there would be no actions that would be off the board completely, such as murder, probably. So I would say the answer to that, I don't think it would.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think if anything, it would have a very difficult time trying to exist.
Mm-hmm. I
If we
wonder.
were to kill off everyone, or if we were to kill off each other and not feel guilty, what would make us take a step back and change our behavior?
I wonder if that's part of why animals. I mean, there's a number of reasons why animals have not been able to. Animals that are not humans, even animals that are social, have not been able to form civilizations. But I wonder if the lack of guilt as a fundamental part of their psychological makeup is conceivably what would limit them, or at least one of the things that would significantly limit animals from forming the sort of society that human beings have created.
And I also wonder, this is kind of going down the rabbit hole, but what changed within us as humans that made us recognize these things, that made us recognize the importance of a community? I mean, is a community truly important because it's ingrained within us, or is it important because we made it important?
If we made it important, it's because I believe we need it in order to maintain our I don't know if this is a whole reason, but I suspect that at least part of the reason is that we have an evolutionary drive to stay at the top of the food chain, the top of the totem pole. And community is a necessary prerequisite for that. Think about us as animals.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have armor. We aren't particularly strong. We can't run that fast. We don't have tails. We don't have claws or huge mouths full of teeth. We have our intellect. We have the ability to make tools. We have the ability to build a community and organize and destroy anything that threatens us, including microbial life. We wipe it out if it threatens to kill us without remorse. One could argue that that's a species-wide genocide.
And one could also argue that maybe that's one of the most powerful tools that's available there. Even in a situation where it's a life or death, having the ability to think through the situation and not respond solely based on the emotion at hand is a very powerful tool. I mean, think about it. If you were in the same room right now as a lion or a tiger that's ready to eat you, there is still a way, there's a chance. I don't know what that chance looks like, but there's still a chance that you might be able to get out of the situation alive due to your ability to think, due to your ability to use what's at hand as a form of distraction, as a resource. There is a way that you can actually win the animal over to your side due to your ability to think through the situation.
And
And
it's
like
the only
that's
thing you'd have, really.
That's fascinating that you can do that as a human. I have no idea how we got here from the topic of guilt, but to me, that's a really fascinating concept, that as a human being, there are so many situations that one could face, and this whole concept of guilt and how it ties into it and feeling guilty for some of the things that other beings do not feel guilty about. You know, Caleb probably does not feel guilty when he gets into a fight with another dog, even in a situation where he hurts the dog. He doesn't go back and apologize to the
True.
dog. He goes on with the rest of his day.
They just go find another tree and pee on it.
That is actually the reality of the matter now.
It is.
So is that guilt? Or is that a lack of guilt?
I read that in ancient Roman times, a child was not considered alive until after it had existed for a certain period of time. I don't know exactly what it was. And so because of that belief system, children who were viewed as defective or otherwise unwanted were often put on a mountaintop or thrown in a river or whatever and left to die of exposure or through predation. And the parents that did that sort of thing really didn't feel guilt, nor was there social judgment on them. In fact, sometimes you would hear things saying, oh, that child, why did the parents even bother to raise him or her? They should have been exposed at birth. Today, leaving aside the status of an unborn being, once a child comes out of its mother's womb, and assuming it is not a stillborn, there is tremendous social judgment upon a human being that were to hurt, let alone kill, an infant like that. Almost indescribable. And so that also has me wondering, to what extent can or does guilt untether from our natural instincts and any objective sense of ethics and merge into purely an expression of cultural norms? In this case, a cultural norm being when life is believed to have begun.
And to what degree, I think that's a great point. And also, to what degree does that concept of guilt transform into, as you described, the judgment, the shame, the embarrassment? And then at what point does it truly just become the norm as a way to operate from? I mean, I'm looking back at everything now. I genuinely don't try to judge, especially when it comes to other people or just beings in general, for the way that they are or why they do certain things. You know, not to go completely on the whole Caleb dialogue for this conversation, but like when he'll bark, what to me appears to be a random thing, you know, a mailman outside, or like someone taking out the trash or whatever it is. I find myself, even in a situation where I tell him to no or stop doing it, to recognize, like, why am I doing that? You know, I'm feeling guilty because he's making noise that is not acceptable or you know, it's just, there's a unspoken, I think, set of expectations and assumptions that I carry. And so once the noise level gets above that, then I'm feeling guilty for his action, when the reality of the matter is, who set that standard to begin with? Me. My neighbor never came up to me and he said, hey, your dog can never bark. So I think that's a really interesting thing, as far as to at what degree does something become a cultural norm and just the way that you operate life, and then to what degree do some of these things transform? Like I'm truly looking forward to being able to travel to some of these countries in however many months from now, because I'm expecting that I will be able to see the difference in some of these things, like how guilt is processed here compared to how guilt is processed in Africa or in India, or some of these other places. And I know you've been to quite a few of those places,
Mm-hmm.
and you might be able to add on as far as what your perspective is. Like, I mean, what does judgment look like?
Well, it is interesting because these cultural norms have people saying things that are deemed socially acceptable that the speakers obviously haven't felt guilty about, that we would feel very, very guilty about. An example came when I was in India. There was a man who, to my eyes, looked like an average size, middle-aged, 50-something American. He had a pot belly and was out of shape, but otherwise normal looking. He looks like millions of American men. And the guide and the driver, who were from India that we were with, when this man walked by, described him as an elephant. And they were just making relentless jokes about how he looked and this, that, and the other. And it was interesting because he really wasn't out of the ordinary looking to my eyes. He just wasn't. B, that sort of behavior offended my sense of morality as an American. It was someone having their looks be the subject of shaming, which in American culture is absolutely unacceptable, at least in polite society, and even in a lot of impolite society. And it's wrong, at least to me. I just don't like it. I don't like engaging in it. I don't like hearing it. And I don't like it around me. And if I'm caught doing that, and I look back in times when I was younger and much less mature, I of course, engaged in that sort of petty, childish behavior. And I'm ashamed and I feel guilty about it.
Do you feel guilty?
Do
you feel guilty because of your ignorance sometimes?
I feel guilty because of yes.
I feel the
or
same
my
way.
lack of sensitivity. That's an interesting question, because ignorance, is that something that we should feel guilty about? And then that goes us to whether we, or more specifically, I, you, or any other individual, should feel guilty about it. Good evening. How are you? James, welcome to the show. We're talking about guilt here, and we very much would love to hear any comments that you have about the conversation, or just your thinking about guilt generally. Do you feel it? Do you feel we're talking about guilt and whether that is purely a result of culture or what triggers it? And Oleg, you were asking ignorance, whether we should feel guilty about ignorance. If I believe that that's something that I should have known better about, yes, I do feel guilty about it. If it's something there's no way, that goes back to the example I had at the top of the hour. There's no way in heck that I should have known or could have known that this woman's father had died. She didn't tell me. No one told me. And the minute I was told, the minute I became non-ignorant, I stopped giving her a hard time for not smiling and laughing at my brilliant jokes. So part of me understands that that's part of why I should not have felt guilty about that whole situation, because I was ignorant and there was no way that I could conceivably have not been ignorant. Now, if I were to be ignorant about secondhand smoke, like that's a controversy that some people may or may not feel about. And I'm not going to state my own feelings, but I will say, at least conceivably, if I were to be smoking at home, not knowing that secondhand smoke could hurt my husband, and he was enduring that for a number of reasons. Let's say he just, for whatever reason, had no say in the matter. Then maybe I should feel guilty, because it's not like the dangers of secondhand smoke are unknown.
Yeah. Would you say that in that case, do you carry a responsibility to assume?
To assume knowledge?
To assume knowledge?
Tough question. I personally, Scott Mason, do believe that I have a responsibility, a moral obligation to absorb as much knowledge as I can. That doesn't mean, of course, that I should be absorbing knowledge all the time and never have downtime and never listen to music or go on a walk or something like that. But to the extent that I actually have the emotional capacity to do that and can make choices, I choose to, and believe that there is an ethical component to that, to absorb knowledge and minimize my ignorance, although my ignorance will always be vast. So there is that. However, do I have an ethical obligation to have any particular piece of knowledge? That's a different story, and it's one of those things where, again, as the example expands out and out and out, well, where's that threshold? What should I know and not?
That's a really good topic. I mean, seriously, it's a really good topic now that I think about it, because it goes, at least for me, what it makes me think of is this whole concept of what it means to be a citizen and what are our shared responsibilities and our shared duties as citizens of not only this country, but of this neighborhood, this building, the unit that we're in.
Our own households,
our families, our friends, anyone that we're connected to. I mean, like you said, even in that scenario right there, how many different entities did we just name? 10, 20? And at what point does it stop?
Yeah.
So I guess, therefore, level of ignorance will always exist. It will just transform. You know? Like, is it actually possible to not be ignorant ever? I mean, what if you've never traveled to a part of the world, and then you go there, and due to your lack of cultural knowledge, you will find yourself in a situation of ignorance. How could you have known?
There was a book I read in which the mother of the man whose biography it was told him, as someone who has experienced everything that a human being can experience, I'm telling you, you need to blah, 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 blah. And it was a ludicrous statement because, of course, no one can experience everything that a human being can conceivably experience. I cannot, for instance, ever conceivably understand what it is to be a female. I cannot understand what it would be to be a Cro-Magnon man before the invention of writing and before they even had cities. Yet they were still humans. So who am I to ever say? And we look back at some of these things in history and we are horrified. We place tremendous moral judgment and wonder how these people didn't feel guilty. But we can't imagine. Do you think that there are things that we do now and take for granted all the time that people will look back on us and with horror and say, how could you not feel guilty for having done that?
Absolutely. I think there are many practices that come to that. I mean, without stating any particular viewpoints, but how we consume food, how we choose to, not we, but how I choose to treat animals, how I choose to treat the environment, how I choose to whether recycle or not. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm guilty of that. I don't recycle 99% of the time because many of the places I live at don't have recycling. And so then it becomes a challenge to not only gather it together, but find a place where I can recycle it to. Now, that is probably a form of laziness, because if I truly did commit to it, I'd find a place, even though it might be 20 or 30 miles away, that I would have to it. And it's not that extreme. Like, it's not that far. That was a very extreme example. It's probably, 5-minute drive. But still, I mean, my dad, I remember from a very young age, that's one of the very first things that he tried to teach us, the importance of recycling. There were things my brother and I would throw in the trash, and I kid you not, when I would come back from school, that thing, that carton, that package would be in the recycling bin.
Mm-hmm.
So he actually took the effort to look through the trash to see whether or not he was recycling everything that he could. Now, how he chose to develop that habit is perhaps a conversation that I would like to visit with him around. But do I feel guilty about that? I do. And the reason why I feel guilty is because I know I could do better. But I just personally haven't developed enough of a habit to do better. I feel like that is a situation where in my current state, there's a lack of knowledge. There's a lack of education about not only what I could recycle, and then I think there's also the lack of knowledge when it comes to developing this into a habit. Do you recycle?
Fervently. And I compost too. And I recycle everything. And I am like your dad. I will pull stuff out of the trash and I will put it in the recycle. And then when I go to the recycling bin, I will take things out that should not be in there because I understand that screws up the whole recycling process. And I'll put them in the regular landfill bags. And there is a composting event that occurs every Sunday starting at 9:00. That is a 10-minute bicycle ride from my house. And so every Sunday morning before I go to the gym, my routine is to get the compost that I have saved all week. And my husband I bought him into this too. And I put those nasty bags on a bicycle and I do that 10-minute ride. And then I drop it off and then I go to the gym. And unless I'm out of town, in which case I put the compost in the freezer to wait until I'm back to compost it, I will be there faithfully. And then during the darkest days of the pandemic, budget was cut for that by the city and they didn't have that program. And I'll never forget when I walked by that station one day, randomly, the location where it normally was, and I saw that they were about to open. I asked them when it was going to open, what the hours were going to be. And I was back there that first day. I was so excited. I went and I told my husband the composting is back. Yeah.
Can I ask why you do it?
Yeah, that's interesting. It goes as to ignorance. And I do. Melody, it's good to see you. Welcome. It is always good to have you back. I do it because when I worked for the city of New York, I was responsible for legislative affairs for one of the agencies that I worked for. And I would go into city council hearings. And in one of those hearings, while I was waiting for the bill that I was working on to appear, there was a lengthy presentation given about composting. And apparently composted organic trash going into the waterways of New York City's rivers was actually causing worse pollution damage than inorganic regular landfill waste. Because as it dissolved, it brought all these gases into the water that deprived it of oxygen. So all the animal life in there and the plant life just died. And so I did not ever want to be part of that problem. It was so horrifying. And when they talked about the implications of it, it was ignorance. I had been ignorant before of this. Well, this presentation woke me up. And as a matter of fact, I was so excited at a Toastmasters meeting recently. I saw that there is a proposal out there to plant oysters in the rivers around the city because oysters clean this stuff up. Yeah.
Wow.
And there's a whole charity that you can donate to. And I have remembered that. I plan on, when I am rich enough, to be able to actually give money to that charity because I believe in that passionately after seeing that presentation. That was clear back in the early, well, it was a couple of days ago. Like we are ending. Thank you.
I'm signed up for that. Because that sounds incredible. It's fascinating to me how, it goes back to the whole guilty, even in that particular case. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but do you ever feel guilty by the fact that someone comes up with an idea that you just sit there and it's like, wow, how did they do that?
Yeah, I don't feel guilty because of my own. I don't feel guilty because of my own lack of ability. And Melody, you knew about the oysters. I think we're talking about ignorance here. Well, this is an area where your lack of ignorance certainly outshone my ignorance. Thank you for that. And I'm glad people are like you are out there that know about this stuff and can advocate for it, as I'm sure you do. I never feel guilty for my lack of ability, including my lack of intellectual ability. I can't help it. I wish I had different intellectual abilities or more intellectual abilities all the time, but I don't feel guilty about what I don't have or what I wasn't given any more than I feel guilty about or that I don't feel guilty about the way I look or my hair or, whatever, my age. In those, like we are ending the hour. These sorts of conversations that are so deep can be continued on at least one and usually both of your podcasts, if I'm correct. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, I think one of those podcasts is called Overcoming Odds. And like I said, it's something that I started probably 2 or 3 years ago with the intention of creating a space for people to have conversations around different topics, including forms of adversity. How do you reframe it? How can you look at adversity through the lens of what am I here to learn? What is this here to teach me? And then the other one I started, which you were the first guest on,
Proudly.
Power of Your Story, which I will be taking on the road with me to many of these countries that I'll be going to. So I'm really happy, I'm fortunate, and I will also say that I'm privileged to be in this space and facilitate many of these conversations. And I don't feel guilty for my ability to have these conversations and create a dialogue around some of these topics, because I think that I recognize my gifts and I'm doing the best that I can and utilizing them in every way. And you do the same exact thing through your podcast, correct?
Yep. And Melody's last comment actually is an appropriate predicate for my podcast intro. It is Purpose Highway. It is conversations with people that are designed to create spaces to discuss connection with a higher purpose, to build a better self and a better world. And Melody, I think that you are right. Purpose is found through service. All of us who have been given our gifts, I believe, have an ethical obligation to serve. And that is why the squirrels are looking for this nut every Thursday night.
Yeah. And one other thing that I'll add on top of all of that is, for anyone that chose to tune in, have liked anything that was said, or not even necessarily like, but enjoy the conversation, find it fulfilling, find it stimulating enough when it comes to the thought. All I ask, and I'm sure Scott probably has the same ask, if you would leave us your feedback, your comments, your review through Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever other platform that you can find us. I know that would help us tremendously.
Yep. Thank you so much, everybody. And until next week, have a wonderful evening.